You better be watching. You better be watching in the dark. You better be watching.
Mr. Pearson invited me into the house, and I thought for a second, knowing what I know now, I could have been the fourth bag under the house.
I was the main witness. I had to tell them about everything that I found and that I felt that they were under the house. And stared me down, and I just looked right back at him.
I'm Sonia Paz.
And I'm Mark Kospchik.
And we are your host of Investigated.
This podcast describes scenes of true crime details and may not be suitable for all listeners. Please be advised.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to episode 4 of Investigated Podcast. I'm here with my amazing co-host, Mark. How are you today?
I'm awesome today, Sonia. How are you?
Pretty good. I am so excited about today's episode because, boy, do we have a lot of really great stuff for you today, right?
We do, actually. And not to get ahead of everybody or ourselves, but the next several episodes are going to be really exciting because Sonia's been working hard and diligently tracking down some other people, talking to them, and it's really putting together a clear and concise view of this case after the fact, actually. And for those of you who remember, Pearson was caught by a boy who entered a post office with his parents and noticed his FBI photo in the post office. And he told his parents, hey, I think this is the shoe guy that we go buy our shoes from. And then it went from there. What was interesting was that Sonia was able to get that exact wanted poster. So I wanted her to tell everyone how she went about doing that.
Yes, absolutely. And I just also want to say, if anyone is tuning in and just popping into any of these episodes, like 3 or 4 or whatever, you have to start from the very beginning. So if you are joining in now, definitely go back and listen. Well, listen to the trailer and then listen to our intro, of course, but definitely start from episode 1 because you need to hear the whole story. But this is part of a series.
Right. And you can also listen to the podcast on our website, which also has the FBI photograph posted on it. So you should go out there on the show notes page and check that out because then you'll get to see what he really looks like.
Yeah, it looks like as a wanted interstate flight, triple murderer, child abductor, kidnapper, embezzler. Yeah, a lot, right?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
That's our guy. So tell us about the FBI photo and how you became aware of it and how you were able to get it.
Well, from the very beginning, back in November, when I started thinking about this story again, it was late at night because I sleep weird hours. And I thought, I wonder if this guy is still alive or dead. So I Googled him, and one of the results that came up was on an auction site that had the photo of him, that wanted poster, for sale. And here I am sitting in our family room in the dark watching true crime stuff as I always am. And boom, there's Pearson's face staring right at me. And I thought, oh my God, there he is. What the heck? So I did look at the poster and I thought, gosh, should I order that? Kind of creepy. So I waited about a month. And that's when I started digging. Gosh, this seems kind of weird to order, but I thought as I had started approaching getting that video out on TikTok that ended up getting over 20,000 views, I thought, okay, I'm getting this poster and this is going to be the vehicle to get me to really concentrate on telling the story. So I did indeed order it, and then it came in the mail. I got it somewhere around 5 days later. And it was in a clear sleeve with a certificate of authenticity and everything on it. And you could tell it was for real because those were mailed out to different types of banks and post offices and people of interest, like high visibility areas. And it's actually a mailer that is sent out to different people, realtors and stuff like that. So as I'm pulling this thing out, I'm looking at it, and there he is right there, this poster in my hands. And I looked right at him and I stared at it for a minute. And then I said, and pardon the language, but I looked at it and I said, well, there you are, you SOB. It's you and me now. And I'm telling the story for Marianne, Paula, and Pauline. And you don't get to say anything about it. You had your say, and now I'm saying mine. Then I called him some more terrible names. And that was the first real document that I had to really start with the search, to start getting everything just documented.
And you've done an awesome job since then, because it seems like every day we're coming up with some new news, some new people that we talked to, and it seems like our direction is going the right direction.
I think so. And one of the things, like I had mentioned in one of our previous episodes, in talking with John Radvin Jr., who's Pauline Pearson's nephew, is that he said to me, if you're going to tell the story, you have to tell the whole story. So with that said, the amount of details that you and I are talking about is really critical, because I have so much details that, I mean, I'm going to share it. What's the purpose of even talking about all this stuff if you can't share all the details? And I always kind of put it in that analogy of, if you're watching cooking videos and you see them, putting ingredients into a bowl and maybe a little piece of tomato or celery gets stuck to the bowl. I always wonder, did they scrape that bowl, or did they pour all the batter into the pan? So what we're doing here is pouring the batter into, we're scraping the bowl and getting everything, because I know so many people who listen to this style of podcast on true crime and murders and a variety of different types of things want these details.
Right. That's why we're going into so much detail.
Right. So Mark, tell us, where did we leave off last week?
So last week we left off with Pearson being arrested in Biloxi, Mississippi, and we wanted to let the listeners know a little bit about his life in Biloxi, because he had actually spent most of his time there. It's about 6.5 years. So we wanted to go through his life there from his perspective, and then pick apart what he actually told the police as he was being interviewed about his life there.
Right. One of the things was that he was brought to the FBI office, and he sung like a bird. He just talked and talked and talked. The FBI didn't interrogate him. They just brought him in because he was a wanted criminal. But they didn't question him, but he just started singing. Is that normal?
I would say it's about 50-50. A lot of people know that when they're arrested, that they should ask for an attorney and not go into any discussions with the police. But then a lot of people think that they can clear themselves by talking to the police, and that gets them in more trouble. So I would say, I think at that point in his mind, he knew he was caught and he wasn't going anywhere. So he may as well have tried to sing his song the way he wanted to and put it on the record.
Right. Because when I interviewed Sergeant Monty Macer of the Santa Clara Police Department, I had asked him if he and Harry Burns, when they went to Mississippi to pick him up, he had talked. He said no. He didn't say a word. He did so much talking at the FBI office, but by the time that they came along, he was told to basically clam it up and not say any more.
Right, because I think at that point he was given an attorney, and that's probably what the attorney advised him.
Right.
The other avenue that we received some information from was a 27-page letter that Pearson wrote. That's pretty much what we're going to talk about. His life in Biloxi came from. And he'd put that letter together for his sentencing. But there's a lot of information that he wrote in there that makes more sense presenting it now than it does later. There are also some things that he put in there for sentencing purposes after he was convicted that we'll go into later.
Right. So he was brought back to California. What happened when he landed back in California and was being processed? Go ahead and give us that timeline.
we do have a pretty good timeline as to what happened and the dates and times and who the people were that were involved. So Pearson was brought back from Biloxi on 8/8/78, where he was arraigned in Santa Clara Superior Court. He was put into custody and bail was set. And the next court hearing was October 30th, 1978, which was a pretrial conference with both sides. The judge wanted to know what was going on. And then that was then set for an 11/20 motions hearing for what was going to happen in trial. December 4th, 1978 was when it started trial. They picked a jury, and he was convicted shortly thereafter in a 6-day trial. And that was with, I believe, 7 women and 5 men. And the jury found him guilty. And then he was scheduled to be sentenced on January 11th, 1979. But that was postponed until January 25th, 1979, where the judge gave him 2 life terms along with 1 5-to-life term for Paula, the strangulation case. And all 3 sentences were going to be run concurrently, and he was eligible for parole in 7 years.
That's unbelievable. Only 7 years.
Right. And I believe we're going to find out why it was only 7 years, because in today's sentencing, when you have an aggravated circumstance like he had, which was using a weapon to kill someone after he had killed someone else, usually those terms are 25 years to life, and you're not eligible for parole until you do your 25. So that struck me as very, very interesting why he was given parole options at 7 years.
Yeah. Boy, oh boy. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Jeez.
We also wanted to give a rundown of who was involved in this trial and pretrial. So we basically have the DA. The initial DA was Stan Wilson, and the trial DA was George Kennedy. The detectives on the case were Stan Curry and Monty Macer and a detective, Harry Burns. There were several people that we know of right now that testified in the case, and that was the medical examiner, John Hauser, who did the autopsies of the 3 dead women, along with Mary Wingate. There was another witness, Mrs. Robert Benzer, Rita Arstell, and Arlene Rausch. Pearson's defense attorney, N.A. Tony Christensen, was a public defender who was assigned his case and took it to trial. The interesting thing about this case is you have Pearson coming back to the state of California, and his trial comes up so quickly and goes to trial so quickly that it amazed me, because nowadays, if you have a case that is a triple murder, that on average takes about 1 to 3 years to prep and go to trial. And this all happened within 5 months.
Yeah, that's unheard of in this day and age. I mean, maybe in my defense, of course, as far as being a native Santa Clarian, is that maybe this was so unheard of, and there was not a lot going on in this little tiny community that it took priority. Who knows?
That could be. I mean, it probably was one of the biggest cases they ever prosecuted, but it's still amazing to me that a defense attorney would not take his time to put on a good case if he thought that he had one.
Right, right. And yeah, it's interesting.
So we're going to now move on to the Biloxi life and times of Mr. Pearson.
On Monday, January 29th, 1979, the San Jose Mercury News ran an article which was titled "Reflections of a Man Who Killed His Family." This was reported by staff writer Maline Hazel, and she did cover many of the Pearson cases throughout the time. The article starts out quoted as, "How did I happen to murder my wife and 2 daughters?" And so it begins, an introspective and lengthy report written to the court by James Arthur Pearson, the convicted murderer who has led 3 lives. Pearson had nothing to say Thursday when he was sentenced to life in prison for the slaying of his first family nearly 10 years ago. He had said it all in a 27 handwritten page letter that he had submitted to the court prior to his sentencing. Pearson emerges from the statement, laboriously printed out on lined yellow legal paper, as a man who accepted his acts and expects to be punished, but longs for the return to the Garden of Eden, as so he puts it, as he and his third wife had found it in rural Saucier, Mississippi. In answering to his own opening question, Pearson says, "I'm not sure I know how it all happened, although I have thought about it a lot lately." He then details his life, his early employment history, and eventual transfer from Oregon to the San Jose office, where he had worked as a manager at a collection bureau. He talks a lot about his first family with fondness, but the love he professes to have had for Pauline, his wife, and his 2 daughters, Paula and Marianne, is tinged with a sense of regret and certain aspects about the family relationship. Pearson says at one point, "I made good money and my family got just about anything that they wanted, but they always seemed to want more."
So what I find interesting in that first section of the article is that he says that he doesn't really remember what happened, but yet when he testified in his trial, he completely knows what he did and he spells it out for the jury. But yet in this sentencing letter that he puts together, he narcissistically says, I really took a lot of time to think about what's going on, and this is what I remember and conveniently don't remember, right?
Right. Well, then it's so he says here they always seem to want more. What is he blaming them?
Right, and that's the other, and I hate bringing the word up, narcissist, but that's where people in his psychological profile say, "Oh yeah, it's my fault, but it's other people's fault and it drove me to this." And so, right, he says he brings in lots of money and he provides for his family, but yet he blames them for drawing all the money out and him being in the situation that he's at, which is always blaming others for his own actions.
And everyone is going to start seeing how this is a common thread of things that he feels and states and is documented, is that he doesn't take the blame.
Right. And what would be interesting, and I think we're trying to find this out, is if at trial or during pre-trial things, did the defense team bring in a psychiatrist or a psychologist that may have evaluated him and wanted to use him as an expert to give the jury a different perspective of what Pearson may have been going through if he was mentally ill in some aspect?
Absolutely.
So, Sonia, what else does he say in the letter?
So it says here, Pearson describes Pauline as an excellent housekeeper and mother who was strict with the girls, but very seldom ever spanked them. At some times, she did yell quite a bit. He stated, "I doubt if I ever paddled the girls more than once or twice," he recalls. "However, when I told them to do something, they did it. I guess that sounded pretty mean. I didn't mean to, though." He tells of problems that developed in the collection office where he worked because of resentment between the older employees and some of the newer employees. And he also said he had a feeling that he neglected his family life because he worked long hours. He also states, "At the same time, I was having trouble at home. My wife was on a spending spree that she had never really done this before, and she never really spent money on herself, however, did spend it on the girls. She also spent it on the house and even on Pearson." He stated that he tried to stop this spending behavior, but she just couldn't seem to stop. Again, let's just blame her.
Well, right. And then I believe in that same letter, didn't he write a check for $300 to be cashed, and that's how he got fired from work?
Yeah. Yeah, he did write a check for $300 at his office for cash, and it did bounce due to her spending habits, that she apparently was writing checks left and right, and he was not aware of any of this. It was that bounce check that Pearson said spelled the end of his career at the collection bureau, and he was fired.
Right.
And
And so after he's fired, he loses his job. He blames Pauline for overspending. He tries to get the property from his mother-in-law. He knows that his girls are going to continue schooling and one wants to go to college. And so right now, I think in his mind, he has no way out. Everything that he tries to do doesn't work out for him.
correct. Yep. I mean, he's desperate at this point because he had tried to make the check good. He begged his former employer at the credit bureau to rehire him and tried to get him to try to convince the former boss that he should be rehired, but that did not happen. And because he hadn't taken a vacation in years, he decided, well, I'll just wait 2 or 3 weeks and then the family would do something together. And apparently they did. He states, I realized that I had neglected my family terribly, and I worked long hours, worked a lot of evenings, and when I could, I would spend evenings at home. I really didn't do things much with my family outside of playing golf. He continues to say, I did love them, and I tried to give them everything that they wanted. But I will say, though, I've always felt the pressure from them that there was always something more that they wanted, and that was probably because I wasn't really giving myself. But I know that now. Now, I mean, he's got 2 teenage daughters. They're going to want stuff. They're going to want money to go to the movies. They're going to want some extra money for going to the mall or some cosmetics or hair stuff or magazines or whatever. I guess that didn't come into play. And teenagers are expensive. As your children get older, they eat more. They require more attention. They need more things. And because he always tried to live outside his means, this came back to bite him.
Well, and I also think that because he wasn't around and he, quote, worked all the time and so hard, that he really didn't know the family dynamics of the day in and day out stuff of what his wife was going through with his 2 daughters. I mean, even if you have the world's greatest 2 daughters, there has to be time spent with doing things. I mean, Paula was a great student and she was going to go to college to a good school if she could afford it. Well, it turned out that Pearson couldn't afford it because he ran the family finances down to the ground.
He did. I mean, way down the ground. He continues to write that after 3 or 4 good weeks with his family, Pearson decided that it was time to get back in the saddle and get a job. I was beginning to hurt financially, he says. I applied for many jobs and those were fruitless. They went no place. By June, Pearson said that his mother-in-law had come to visit from Pennsylvania. And as we had discussed before, this was Pauline's mother. She was an older woman. And he felt that he was constantly criticized by the mother-in-law for not doing enough work around the house, not doing enough for the girls, the way that they dressed. And he kind of clams onto that as far as feeling as though he was being criticized. And then, of course, we also know that Mrs. Pearson had gone to work at the Kitty World Fashions in San Jose because she had to rise to the occasion to really help out with the family finances. And her mother had made fun of Pearson when he did try to help out with housework and other things. And that was the time when he packed her up and dropped her off at the San Francisco airport, sometimes shortly thereafter.
So here you have Pauline stepping up and actually getting a job and helping out the family, where Pearson now feels, oh, woe is me, and then gets kicked in the butt by mother-in-law, who then pisses him off and he sends her to the airport.
Right.
Nice guy.
Nice guy.
So as we heard from previous episode, he drops off his mother-in-law at the airport. And I think at this point, he really is in a bad state mentally, and he has no recourse. And I think what happens the day that he walks in on Marianne and Paula was the breaking point.
Right. Or so he says.
Correct.
Right. And that is just approaching fall of 1969. And he still didn't have a job. And Marianne had just started Cupertino High School. And Paula was waiting for classes to begin at De Anza. She really had hoped to enroll at Occidental College to prepare for a job in foreign service. He says that he just couldn't afford it and that Paula was really, really disappointed. He says that he felt bad about this, but he couldn't help it. Pearson stated he felt especially close to the outgoing Paula, that she would talk with him often and that she would play the piano for him.
Right, and that's why he ended up killing her first.
Right. He was concerned when Paula began dating a long-haired rock band drummer, but Paula assured him that she would never use drugs. And I have to vouch for that. I don't believe that ever happened. So, as we know, on September 22nd, 1969, Pearson said that he had gone out and was looking for a job, had an interview selling some type of a food product, but was turned down because they stated that he was, quote, overqualified, end quote.
I'm wondering if he was overqualified or if they didn't give him the job because he was older, which then would have added to his mentalness being rejected once again.
Right. And he was 48 at the time.
Which
right?
back in the 70s, when life expectancy wasn't what it is today, that was pushing it.
Yeah. I know. I don't know. I mean, throughout this writing, he strikes me as very cavalier and very self-confident. So they might have just told him he was overqualified just to make him go away.
Right.
I know.
But because he's such a sweet talker, I'm surprised he didn't get the job. So there was obviously something there other than just that he was overqualified.
So it states here, often lapsing into identical phrases he used during testimony at his trial, Pearson tells that afternoon in September, when he had returned home, found Paula rolling cigarettes, which he had believed to have been marijuana, as Marianne was sitting with her and watching. He stated that when he yelled at her, Paula shot back, "You son of a bitch, you can't even get a job." He states, "I reached out, I got her by the throat. I wasn't trying to hurt her. She seemed to collapse instantly. I tried to revive her. She was dead. It was crazy. It was unbelievable." Okay.
Right. And as we'll find out later, that's kind of not how he testified to in trial, which was a little bit different. I also think that when she spouted off to him that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I think he went into a full-blown rage and grabbed her throat and just killed her.
Right. And we will talk about this in future episodes when we get to the coroner's report, but it takes an incredible amount of force to choke somebody.
It does.
Pearson recounts sitting in the living room in a complete daze until Pauline and Marianne came back into the room and started screaming at him. Now, mind you, Marianne took off during the beginning of this shouting match between Pearson and Paula. And we'll talk more about the inconsistencies about that in a few minutes. But he stated that after grabbing a meat tenderizer from his wife's hand, he says he hit both of them. "I was making no conscious effort to do any of this, but remember doing this," he says. His wife and second daughter soon were dead. He stated, "When I realized what had happened, I went to call the police, but I simply couldn't. I wasn't only afraid, but I was ashamed." He had thought that he would kill himself, but he didn't have a gun. And he had no poison in the house to kill himself with poison.
Coward.
And coward, big time. Come on, dude. You have all these opportunities.
Right. So he decided he'd just choose the other way, which was, let's just kill 2 more people and bury everybody under the house.
So he decided to run, although he says, "I didn't have any hopes of successfully doing this. I wrapped the bodies in plastic and hid them under the house. I never intended to harm my family." Things just happened, he says. I was really stunned when the jury didn't believe this. I never expected a first-degree verdict. He insists that his testimony was truthful.
Well, and it probably was truthful in his mind, where he thought, I didn't really mean to kill him, but I did kill him. And that may have been the case with Paula, where it was out of rage that he did it. So if you believe that was the portion of what we call crime of passion, where you just lose it at the moment and there's no premeditation involved in that, that one would have passed probably as not a murder one charge. The problem is he then comes up with a common scheme and plan when Pauline and Marianne return and kills them. That's the premeditation portion of it.
Right. Yeah, well, yeah, I find the story hard to believe. And in his letter, he writes, I guess it does sound hard to believe. I'm sure that if I wanted to do so, I could have made a more believable story, he says. But...
And that's a shock there. I mean, he's like, I could have come up with a better story is what he's saying.
Right. Right.
How manipulative is that, right? Oh, well, wait, this story's not fitting right here. I think I'll come up with something else.
Right. Although stunned by the verdict, Pearson said he is prepared for what is to be. I am 53 years old, and at my age, any sentence can be a life sentence, he says. He concludes that portions of his report is, I loved Pauline and the girls. I made a mistake in trying to show my love by giving them material things. I'm sure that this would have been different if I had spent more time with them. I wish I could live my life over. Well, of course you do, because you got caught.
Right.
My sarcasm. I'm so sorry. No, I'm not sorry. I can't help it. I've read this so many times that it just, the lunacy of it all is just unbelievable.
And it's not heartfelt, right?
No, he's written it as if he's here. Is this what you want to hear? Because that's what I'm going to tell you.
Well, and it's like, I'm sorry for hurting them and doing that, but I want to try my life over again. It's all about him.
Right. Yep. Here's where it gets really interesting. So in the second part of Pearson report, he talks about his life after the murders and pledges to live a good life if he is granted probation. Pearson details his flight to Cedar City, Utah. He discusses his marriage there to Arlene Roosh and the birth of their son. He states the boy was christened Albert D. Ford Jr. Pearson used the name Albert D. Ford in Utah. Mrs. Roosh /4 was a Mormon, and Pearson joined the Mormon Church. He tells of problems with her older children from her first marriage and contends that Mrs. Roosh was a, quote, poor mother. Although I was living a lie, he says, I joined the church. Boy, sounds like a godly man.
Right.
He meets her in the winter at the end of 1969, and he starts to work and has this child with her and is working at a couple of motels and starting a few businesses where he's getting investors. So he didn't have any idea what was happening in California and didn't know that nothing had yet been discovered. So he decided that he would leave Cedar City because he knew he was getting in a hot mess with all of these bogus deals that he was doing. He says that he loved his son so much that it hurt. And little Albert D. Ford Jr. was the apple of his eye. So he was born in January of 1971, but initially had planned to leave him in Cedar City. But Pearson stated, a child needs a mother, Pearson explains, but, quote, something happened to change his mind. Pearson says that after that statement is a half page of writing, which apparently explained his decision to take the boy with him, but the printing had been covered with whiteout and was illegible. It was not readable. Pearson and his 11-month-old son traveled to Biloxi, Mississippi, where he got a new job at a shoe store. And several months later, a fellow employee introduced him to Jacqueline Nichols, who had a 4-year-old daughter.
Right. And didn't he leave Utah under the auspices with his then wife that he was going to take the boy on a trip to get to know him better?
Yes. Said, I feel like I haven't bonded with this child and I'm going to go on a business trip and let me take little Albert Jr. so I can get better acquainted with him.
And so Mom, seeing that this was a great way to have those two bond, didn't think twice about letting him take him.
Right. Pearson writes that Jacqueline Nichols, she showed class from the very beginning, and he had fell in love with her and her daughter, Teresa. Before he married Mrs. Nichols, Pearson said he had telephoned Utah and found out that Arlene had divorced him. Mrs. Nichols married Pearson, who now used the name George David Watson III, on January 5th, 1973. And the couple soon added foster children to their family, and other foster children followed. Pearson tells of helping the children with their schoolwork. And as the family grew, he said that he felt that they needed more room and finally purchased a large brick and block home on 3.7 country acres outside of Biloxi, Mississippi. It's at this point in Pearson's letter that he goes through this diatribe of insane, ridiculous lunacy that states, I used to say that it was our Garden of Eden and that we had 4 fig trees, a crab apple tree, and those were where apples just don't seem to ever grow. We also had 3 pear trees, a quince tree, 2 peach trees, wild plum trees, wild huckleberries, dewberries, 11 pecan trees, 4 kinds of oak trees, pine trees, gumball trees, dogwood, azaleas, magnolias, wild holly, umbrella trees, etc.
And a partridge in a pear tree.
And a partridge in a pear tree. Good lordy lordy. Let's take inventory. You can remember this at your older age, but you can't remember killing your wife and 2 daughters in detail.
Or how it happened.
Or yeah. He states, I cut wood off Forest Service land to heat the house. I had a good garden, cucumbers, tomatoes, zucchini, yellow crookneck squash, pie and jack-o'-lanterns, pumpkins, and popcorn for the kids. I grew Irish potatoes, sweet potatoes, green beans, carrots, onions, garlic, etc., and I was really proud of it. Oh, and as an afterthought, Pearson also adds that his family also grew cantaloupe and watermelon. Let's not forget the cantaloupe and watermelon, right? Because that's going to make a huge difference in this letter.
Right. Well, it makes him look like he's a good farmer.
The first time I read this, I literally busted out laughing. And of course, let's not forget the animals. Some of the children had chickens, others had a ewe, a ram, and a calf. Pearson says that he put up a basketball hoop, and they had volleyball and badminton net. They played football, they played baseball, and even hit some golf balls together with his own children and of the neighborhood kids. Wow, what do you think of that?
It's amazing to me that he goes into so much detail about his Garden of Eden after being absconded from California for 6.5 years, and that he can't bring it upon himself to tell the whole truth of what happened in that house. It's
correct.
Seems to me just a complete juxtaposition of his brain and what he thinks.
Right. And you and I have talked about this article and this letter. This is the summary of the letter in great detail. And I mean, complete delusion. I mean, he's so proud of all this stuff. And this takes up a large segment of his letter. He blames others. He goes on about the Garden of Eden, all the plants and the trees and the more trees and the crookneck squash and the pies and popcorn and everything else. And you know, is this a delusion? Is he delusional in his own head? You know, he's obviously delusional in his own head.
I think it's his way to escape the truth.
Of course, then in 1976, Pearson left the shoe store where he had worked for several years and went to work for a competitor, Lou Saunier. Pearson said that Saunier still had faith in him, and he has helped my family and me since my arrest and wants me back if and when I'm ever free again. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen.
No.
No. Looking back, he musses, I think guilt led me to want to work with children.
You think?
You think?
The guilt part, I mean.
The guilt, yeah. I mean, yeah, he's got a suitcase full of guilt. Pearson doesn't mention that, in fact, third wife, Mrs. Watson, had fled from the Saucier farmhouse with young David and her own daughter. She took off. However, Mrs. Roosh was still attempting to locate her biological son, Albert D. Ford Jr., also now known as George David Watson IV.
Also known as just David.
Right, yes, as of presently, we learned that. Just now known as David. He does note, however, that the foster children he had hoped to adopt have been since placed in other homes. In this whole documentation from Pearson, this is the sentence that just kills me. He says, my Garden of Eden went away with my arrest. He stated, I loved all of my family, and I pray I haven't hurt them too much. Well, yeah, the Garden of Eden is, I would have called it the Garden of Evil, but of course it went away. Yeah.
Or the Garden of Guilt.
The Garden of Guilt is that it went away with the arrest. Well, obviously so. And Mrs. Watson did take off because then, Arlene Roosh was looking for her son. So the reasons of why that never happened or why she didn't turn him over or want to reunite the natural mother with her own son is, we're still looking into that. So hopefully we'll have answers soon. But Pearson praying that he hasn't hurt them too much. This is 3 families that he has completely annihilated. I mean, he brutally murdered my friends in Santa Clara, California, left Arlene and her 4 children in dire straits in Utah. And now, what does he do? Call Mrs. Watson from the jail. Honey, I won't be home because I got arrested for living a life of lies and a farce. So he continues to just say that I can't save myself. Only God's grace can save me. I've confessed my sins and have asked for forgiveness. But he says, I know Christ has paid my fine.
Apparently he's resolved his sins with the higher being.
I guess. Says, I pray that I can someday be worthy of this. I pray God will help those I have hurt and bless my family. He did not know at the time that he wrote this report that he would be sentenced to prison or be granted probation. So this was a letter that he was writing in hopes to give the court an understanding of who he is and that he's a caring person and he's a farmer and that he still has God and Christ in his pocket to give him some sort of a whatever.
Well, and obviously the judge didn't believe it because he got hammered with 2 life sentences and a third.
Right. In the conclusion, he stated, I would like to try and write a book of fiction, he said. I have an idea in mind. I'd never write about my case. I'm certainly not proud of it. I live for the day that I can again be with my family. Interesting is that we're telling your story, James, Jimmy. We're telling the story and we're keeping to the facts. And what you did was a horrible thing. And maybe you're not writing about it, or maybe you haven't written about it, but we're on this podcast to tell the story on behalf of all of the people that you have hurt throughout this reign of terror that you created, that you've left, and the lives that you've ruined in the process and are continuing to affect people to this day. In any event, I just wanted to say that, and I will continue reading this article. Superior Court Judge James A. Wright sentenced Pearson to 2 concurrent life sentences and a 5-year to life term. The probation officer who read Pearson's statement recommended that he be sentenced to prison rather to be granted probation. Judge Wright indicated on the day of sentencing that he had to read the statement, which was attached to the probation report. Pearson will be eligible for parole consideration in 7 years. His second wife, Mrs. Roosh, is living in Arizona near the home of one of her daughters. She still hopes to someday regain custody of the son, even to this day, whom she calls David. Mrs. Watson, her daughter, and Pearson's son are officially missing. That was at the time that this article was written. And although Biloxi police claim to be looking for them, some reports say that they are living with relatives in New Jersey. There has been no official word on their whereabouts. Mrs. Watson and her children left town after Mrs. Roos initiated legal action to regain custody of her son. So according to this article, that's all that was written. That's all she wrote. And many thanks again to Maline Hazel for documenting this long article. Mark, tell us about what we've recently learned about the son. And this is the burning question everybody has been wondering about. Whatever happened to little Albert Jr. or David Watson IV?
Right. And it was amazing that through Sonia's research, we were able to actually locate David in Arizona, and he is well. We're hoping to make contact with him and talk to him about what he may know about his father and the trials and tribulations of what he went through possibly during Pearson's run.
We've got so much more to give you and new interviews coming up, so definitely stay tuned.
So what we will do is say goodbye for now and stay tuned for episode 5 of Investigated.
Thanks, Mark, for today. This has been a lot of fun, lots of great information. I'm looking forward to next week.
You too, Sonia. Take care and see you next week.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to follow Investigated on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, visit investigatedpod.com to visit our website to learn more about your hosts, Sonia Paz and Mark Kapschik. Follow us on social media and connect with us. Investigated is written, edited, and hosted by me, Sonia Paz, with story advisement and input from Mark Kapschik, and many thanks to the research of criminologist Clark Williams and also to Allison Betts Goldman for her contributions to this story.